Embrace the new technology, but don't lose sense of our humanity, which I think in the context of design and research comes in the form of our expression, right? Our taste, our gut. And I think that if we do that, it means that we don't get left behind, right? Like we're able to leverage this new technology, drive greater efficiencies for ourselves and by extension our customers. But over time, we're still able to build more innovative, more creative experiences that deliver real value for our customers and make us happy in the process. Hopefully this encourages leaders and by extension companies to really champion taste and gut more again, because personally, this has been one of my biggest frustrations over the past couple of years. Like I feel like, you know, over time, we've kind of shifted to this place where we overfixate on the tools and the processes. And as a result, we end up serving them as opposed to the other way around, right? And what happens over time, if that is your disposition, is taste and gut kind of falls to the wayside. And like when I say taste, what I mean is being able to look at something and say, this is good, right? Like this is delightful. This is premium. And when I say gut, what I mean is being able to make a decision, right? Like looking at something and saying, we're going to do this despite X or Y, Z odds, right? And the reason why I think these things have fallen to the wayside is that, you know, if you look at the design process, a lot of it is like rinse and repeat, right? Like you put something out, you get feedback, you iterate, and you're getting, you know, the feedback is kind of like honing the final deliverable, right? But you know, I kind of mentioned earlier that like design is kind of like a mix of science and creativity, right? The scientific method is the rinse and repeat process, but the creativity is like your own distinct taste, right? Like looking at it and saying like, I believe this is good, right? I think a good example that of a company that people tend to look to in this regard is Apple, right? Like Apple has been long known for, you know, being pretty like not as too much on the science side, but more so on the creative side, right? Like they form an opinion about the future. And then they're like, we will bring you to understand that this is the right idea over some period of time, as opposed to you telling us that this is the future and then us iterating there over some period of time, right? But like that is a good example of taste, right? And then gut is like going against the grain, right? Like all the data is telling you X, but you're like, I still want to try Y, right? And then you go and do that and maybe you fall flat, or you go and do that and there's a breakout, right? So taste and gut, I feel like is something that was very prevalent in tech as a space, probably like 5+ years ago. And I feel like over the past few years, as we've gone through all this like rapid rise and rapid hiring, we've gotten so much about just training people to understand the tools and the process that they've kind of like lost sight of taste and gut. And now if you like point blank ask someone in a crit, like, is this good? They almost don't know how to answer the question because that has never been the focus, at least in their mind, of their job, right? So coming back to what we were talking about here with like AI over time, kind of like abstracting away that first step, which is the fixation on learning the tool and process and really forcing people to go to the next step, which is more around like the thinking, the creative thinking, right? I think like teams that will become winning teams are the ones that can bring back taste and gut in that dimension, right? So that means that, you know, like screening for this in interviews or trying to beat this way of thinking back, well, beat is a harsh term, like, you know, like re-encourage this way of thinking in the teams that you support. I think like over some period of time, whether it's a year or 2 years, this will begin to distinguish great companies from like the rest of the pack, you know? We're at a point where there are enough examples of what we can, as a society, all agree is probably good taste, right? So just ingesting that goes a long way. Like I found, I mean, I don't do as much active designing today as I did in the past, but when I was active and I felt creatively stumped, there was no substitute for just opening up a book or going into a museum and just surrounding myself by people who had taste, right? Like I can't quantify what happens in the brain when you do that, but something does happen, right? When you surround yourself by examples of good, it over time begins to influence your ability to produce good yourself. right? So I think if someone is trying to acquire taste or sharpen their taste or whatnot, surrounding yourself by good examples, as abstract of a piece of advice as that may sound, is actually very beneficial, right?
Mhm.
I think for gut, I remember, I can't remember the source, but I remember reading something about gut, and what the person was basically saying is that gut is the compressed number of experiences you've had over some period of time, right? Like it's repetition. You've done this thing enough times that when you see some vague resemblance to a past instance, you have a high degree of confidence to do X because you've kind of seen X before, right? So an
Mhm.
example of this might be like, if you ask me to design a sign up form, right? And I'm like, okay, cool. And you're like, wait, you don't need like a spec. And I'm like, I don't need a spec. I know that there's an email input, there's a password input, there's a button, there's a forgot password, and there's something linked for SSO of your enterprise, right? And it's like, I just
Mhm.
know, right? Like I don't need you because I've seen it so many times, right? So if you're trying to form gut, I think the fastest
Mhm.
way to do that is just repetition, right? Like you
Mhm.
need to put yourself in as many examples or circumstances as possible and actually see them through so that you're beginning to form like memory, right? Like muscle
Mhm.
memory in your brain, such that when you see experiences again, you can kind of make a call, right? And if you're trying to do that quickly, then what that says is that you're trying to get yourself into as much quick feedback loops as possible. Like if you're taking long arc ones, you're going to take a long time to form it, right?
Mhm.
That's one aspect of gut. I think another aspect of gut is just like openness to failing. Like and
Mhm.
that one is just a mentality thing, right? Because like again, like I can see this, I can have seen this thing 10 times and believe that this is what it is, but then still not feel the conviction to go. And like the thing that might block me in that instance, while history dictates that I should know what to do in this moment, is just the failure of failing, right? And
Mhm.
I think that like once you get over the failure of failing, which again, this is a very easy thing to say, it's much harder in practice, but I
Right.
think like that is a big unlock to establishing gut, right?
Mhm.
And I think when you have that combination of like taste and you have gut, right? I think that as a creative field, that really puts us in the best position to really innovate, right? And
Mhm.
like when we think about like what's happening across tech, the consolidation of a lot of our toolkits, the forcing function of the macro environment for a lot of us to start building our tools in a way that it does everything, such that like the distinguishing thing between us and our competitors is just like shrinking and shrinking by the day, right? The real opportunity to innovate and distinguish yourself really comes in the form of having taste and having gut. Less creative the role, the
Mhm.
faster those efficiency gains will come.
Mhm.
Thus, the fewer wrecks will come back, right? And then the
Right.
more creative the role, I think it'll be a little bit longer
Mhm.
before the efficiency gains are reached, right? So if you take design as a discipline, like
Mhm.
the primary tools we use are things like Figma for actually creating stuff, maybe Notion or Jira or whatever for documentation and tracking, things like Marvin for research and whatnot. Like that more or less represents the designer researcher toolkit. But the skill of research and design is very creative in nature, right? Like,
Mhm.
yes, there's science to it, but there's a lot of creativity. And
Yep.
like, I don't yet know how AI is going to drive greater efficiency in that outside of like giving people a good first draft. Another way to frame it is like the opportunity for showing value is going to rise, right? Um, I think whether or not this is going to have to be a part of our job, like can we just show up and do the thing, or do we need to prove why we're here, kind of thing. I think
Mhm.
that will fade over time, but I think we're still in that phase, and that speaks more to just the newness of the function in the context of these tech companies. Where like research as a function is not research as a craft is not new, but research as a discipline embedded within product development teams is new work, right? And therefore, I feel that the proving of value thing speaks more to the newness of the org design
Mhm.
than the technology and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So that's my thought there.
Yeah. No, that's and any I think every domain needs to prove value. I think some values
Yeah,
just get enshrined, like you said, over time, and but every domain, every discipline proves value. Some do it. Some proof it just becomes in long enough. It proves the value is proven long enough that becomes inherent, like web, for
yeah,
example.
yeah. Now I do
Um,
think that
yeah.
teams or companies that just kind of get it and let us have the impact we can have,
Mhm.
they're their earliness to this understanding will compound over time, you know?
Yeah.
So like if you find yourself in an environment where you're just able to just do your thing, do your job, like that's probably going to be a winning environment over time.
Right.